The race for the best animated feature Oscar is heating up, and Missing Link is looking to be a strong contender from the formidable studio Laika. I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I'm joined by the film's writer and director, Chris Butler. Chris, the first thing I want to ask is, what was the origin for developing the story?
Well, first of all, I think it goes back a long, long way. It goes to maybe 15 plus years, maybe 20 years, when I first had, I guess, the hook of the idea, which was, what would you get if you crossed Indiana Jones with Sherlock Holmes and threw in some Ray Harryhausen creatures? So that was kind of the nexus of the idea, if you like. And when it came to it taking shape as a production, after I finished Paranorman, I had a conversation with Travis Knight, and we were talking about what would be a good follow-up movie for me. And, you know, I just did the whole zombie thing with Paranorman, and I wanted to do something that was tonally very different. And we both agreed that was a really good direction for us to go in as a studio too. We like every movie that we make to be a little bit different. So it seemed like this kind of gloriously Technicolor, globe-spanning adventure was the right move for us.
So one of the things that I love about this movie is the cast that you assembled for this. I mean, you have someone like Hugh Jackman in the lead role, and you also have a great choice in Zach Galifianakis as Susan the monster. Yeah. And but you also have like in little bits, like you have a little Britain reunion with David Williams and Matt Lucas, but you also got Stephen Fry in there. What was the casting process like in terms of finding people to voice this, especially with getting someone like Zach Galifianakis to voice the creature? Right.
I think, you know, whenever you start one of these projects, you write a wish list down, and that's your list of actors that you think would be ideal for a certain role. So I had a pretty short list for all of the characters, and long before we go out to anybody, we cut little reels, if you like, where we'll pull dialogue of that actor from another movie, and we'll play that against the current character designs of the character. And that way we try and find a good fit. And we also play them next to each other to see how they work together as sounds, as voices. And I think my lists were pretty short because I had pretty specific ideas about who I wanted. Like, I really wanted Hugh Jackman. And I think that's partly because the character that he's playing, he's the hero, he's the leading man, which is very much Hugh Jackman. But he's also quite problematic. He's eccentric. At times he does some really questionable things. And what I wanted was that likability that Hugh Jackman brings, to help Lionel not go too far in that direction. Zach Galifianakis, again, you know, there was something about his brand of comedy that just seemed perfect for this character. I mean, everything that Zach does is kind of displaced. Like, he's a little displaced, like he doesn't quite fit into any situation. And there's an awkwardness, but there's also a real humanity to that. And I thought that was perfect for this character who's never been around humans before. He's never been in civilization before. I think I loved what Zach did because he brought such warmth to it that really brought the character alive. Hugh, I waited for 6 months actually before he read the script. We were out to him for a long time, but he was so busy on other projects. And finally he read it and he loved it. So he wanted to be a part of it. So we got him down to the studio and showed him around. But usually you wouldn't wait 6 months. But I was quite set on Hugh Jackman. All of the actors were ones that I really wanted to work with. Stephen Fry's always been a hero of mine. And for anyone who lives in England, you know, you'd be very familiar with Stephen Fry. So I was pretty lucky. You know, along the way, you you change your mind about certain characters, because as you're writing, the characters evolve too. But I've got to say, I was pretty lucky on this project in that the characters that were in my head and the actors that were in my head as playing them, I pretty much ended up getting exactly who I wanted.
Does that include other actors like Emma Thompson and Timothy Olyphant?
Yes. Timothy Olyphant was an interesting choice because for the villain, Willard Stenck, we had all kinds of different actors on that list. And it was actually Travis Knight who came up to me and said, I would really like to go for Timothy Olyphant. And I think, at first I was like, playing the ugliest character in our cast, we're going to hire like one of the handsomest men in the world. But I think that's one of the things that we like to do. We like to cast purely on the voice and cast against type.
What's interesting about this is the movie is that it's a stop motion film, and I'm wondering how long did it take to do the actual filming, from the first scene that you filmed all the way to the last scene that you filmed? Because I always find the amount of time that's taken to do that always to be very fascinating.
Yeah, so the actual production itself was 2 years, give or take, and that's a little longer than normal. I think it can be anything from 18 months-ish onwards. But this was such an ambitious movie that we had to expand the shooting schedule a little. So many locations, partly. And when you're doing stop motion, you need to actually physically build all those locations and have puppets to populate them. So it was 2 years. And before that, there was a year of pre-production, and before that, a year of development. So the pre-production and development side are actually quite quick. But obviously for the process alone in stop motion, it slows right down to a glacial pace when you come to the actual shooting. And
I was curious, what scene was the most difficult to shoot at doing it in stop motion? Was there a scene that was more that when you think of how difficult it was, you just go, oh yeah, that was the toughest one to do?
The toughest scene. Almost every scene in this movie was tough. Not always for the same reason. There's a scene where there is a bar brawl, and, it's an enclosed space. There's 4 walls. It's a room. So in some ways that should make it simpler. But when you add into the mix, more than a dozen characters, and that, I think it was something like 7 puppets. So 7 physical puppets were on frame or in frame at the same time. And then added to that, you have a bunch of digital extras. On top of that, because of the nature of the scheduling for a puppet movie, you don't always have those 7 puppets available at the same time. So there was an awful lot of chopping those scenes around. So we'd maybe be shooting 2 characters on half a set, one side of the studio, and at the same time we'd be shooting another character against green screen somewhere else in the studio. And then 6 months later, when another puppet becomes available, we'd shoot that character. And all the time you're trying to match the lighting, you're trying to maintain that kinetic kind of energy of the sequence. So I think just purely practically for the amount of puppets, that scene was very difficult. But then we've got very difficult scenes that are technically different on many levels, like at the end of the movie, the ice bridge collapse, where we've got so many different elements and types of elements at work at the same time. We've got miniature models, full scale sets, green screen. We've got full-scale puppets. We've got miniature puppets. We've got a lot of digital effects. We've got digital set extensions. And we were shooting that for the full 2 years. It's like a 5 or 6 minute sequence. And just logistically, that one was incredibly difficult.
So this isn't your first foray into using stop motion animation. You did Paranorman before this. That also was done through stop motion. I'm curious, what draws you to stop motion animation?
I love stop motion because in the end it comes down to real light on real objects. And that's something that I don't think we can still fake. Not quite perfectly, not yet. It's something that CG is chasing, and I think what they are ultimately chasing is the imperfection of reality. So I think you can still tell something CG because it's a little bit too good, it's a little bit too perfect. And I think when you have real light on handmade objects or handmade costumes, there's still an element of almost chaos to it that is so beautiful. And tactile. You feel like you could reach into the screen and touch these things. So it's partly that. I think originally as well, when I was storyboarding, I always loved storyboarding for stop motion because it's so physical. If you're trying to think of a shot or a composition, you can actually wander onto the set and see where the camera is or imagine where the camera is. You're not just sitting at a desk for the full production, fantasizing. You can actually go onto the set, and I think that in itself made me a better filmmaker because I was thinking about the limitations and not just about how I could fly the camera around in an impressive way. I was thinking about what are the limitations of this shot, what is a good cut from here to here. So I think just filmically, cinematically, it made me think a lot more about the process, and I think that made me a better filmmaker.
So one of the things I loved about the ending to Missing Link is that you kept open the possibility that we could revisit these characters. And is there anything that makes you think that you might want to revisit these characters at some point?
It's probably too soon right now for me. When you spent 5 years with these characters, that's quite a lot. I always liked the idea of this being, just one of many adventures. And yeah, I purposefully wrote it that way. Actually, the first story that I ever wrote with Sir Lionel, there was no Mr. Link, there was no Bigfoot. It was a completely different quest for a completely different creature. And I had a couple of stories about that character actually from years and years ago. And when I pulled them out the bag and kind of dusted them off, I knew it was Mr. Link that was the really compelling part of one of those stories. So I kind of discarded that other one. But yeah, absolutely. There was always the thought in my mind that this was a rich world that hopefully people would enjoy visiting.
And also I want to ask you, so we are an awards website. This isn't your first go around with the Oscar Derby. You were nominated several years ago for Paranorman in the Best Animated Feature category. Very well-liked film. And I was wondering, what was that experience like for you?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's you don't think of that when you first start a movie. Certainly I didn't. It didn't even enter my head, the whole awards process, because you're just concentrating on getting this thing done. And so when that rolled around and I could see how much people liked it, it was thrilling. It was exciting. Terrifying, though, I've got to admit. The actual Oscars themselves, obviously, they're like the granddaddy of them all. And there is something truly special about walking into that particular ceremony. And when you go in, you're kind of looking around and thinking, remember that, remember that, remember that. It was a thrill. It's an honor. It's an absolute honor. I think what it does is the award season to me, it's about your peers celebrating how much effort you put into a project. And that's nice. It's nice when people acknowledge the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. We wish you all the best for this award season. And to our viewers, make sure you click on the subscribe button and make sure to go to Gold Derby to make your awards predictions and see if you can outsmart the biggest experts in Hollywood. Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you very much.